16-year-old girl whispered a secret pain no one would believe, a pain that only found an echo in the silence of a lonely rancher's heart. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The pain began as a whisper, a secret language her own body had started to speak. For Alara, it was a hot, sharp thing that lived at the base of her spine, a malevolent spark that ignited whenever she tried to find rest. "It hurts when I sit," she had said, the words barely a breath in the sterile quiet of Dr. Miller's office. He had smiled, a placid, dismissive gesture that didn't reach his eyes. He'd called it psychosomatic, a manifestation of teenage anxiety, a phrase that felt both too large and too small to hold the jagged reality of her suffering. He'd patted her on the shoulder, the touch feeling like a brand of dismissal, and sent her home with a pamphlet on mindfulness. Her mother, seated beside her, had exhaled a long, weary sigh, the sound of a woman who had already decided this was just another phase, another island of adolescent drama in the turbulent sea of raising a daughter. To them, her body was a text they thought they could read, and they had concluded it was simply telling lies. The world, it seemed, had a very fixed idea of what a 16-year-old girl's pain was supposed to look like, and this invisible agony didn't fit their narrative. So the whisper went unheard, swallowed by the static of expectation. Alara learned to hold the pain inside, to build a fortress of silence around it. She became an architect of her own posture, learning to stand when others sat, to lean against walls with a practiced nonchalance that belied the fire licking at her bones. Her world shrank to the careful management of this secret. The soft cushions of the living room sofa became a minefield. The hard plastic chairs at school were instruments of torture. The family dinner table, a nightly trial of endurance. Each invitation to sit was a new wave of quiet panic, a fresh reminder of her isolation. She saw the glances from her family, the flicker of annoyance in her father's eyes, the deep furrowed worry in her mother's brow that wasn't concern for her pain, but for her perceived defiance. They saw a girl who refused to be comfortable, who chose to be difficult. They did not see the truth. That comfort had been stolen from her. The pain was a thief in the night, and it had taken the simple, thoughtless act of sitting, leaving behind a constant, grinding ache. It was a lonely country, this place of unseen suffering, and she was its sole inhabitant. Her reflection in the window showed a stranger with haunted eyes, and a spine held ramrod straight, a soldier guarding a territory no one else believed was under attack. The whisper was still there, but she had stopped saying it aloud. It had become a prayer, a curse, a constant silent scream echoing in the hollows of her own mind, a place where at least she knew it was real. The town of Havenwood was small enough that a secret was a currency, and a deviation from the norm was a public spectacle. Ilara's peculiar habit of standing, of perching precariously on the edges of chairs as if ready to take flight, had not gone unnoticed. It became another thread in the tapestry of local gossip, woven between talk of crop prices and the pastor's new car. In the school hallways, whispers followed her like a shadow. They called her strange, a drama queen. Teachers would sigh with theatrical impatience when she'd ask to stand at the back of the classroom, their faces etched with a weary disbelief that felt like a physical blow. Each day was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. She'd linger by her locker, pretending to search for a book long after the bell had rung, just to delay the inevitable agony of taking her seat. She ate her lunch leaning against the cold brick of the gymnasium, watching the other kids cluster together on benches, their easy, thoughtless comfort a world away from her own. Her body was a constant betrayal, and the town's collective gaze was the salt in the wound. They judged what they could not see, and in doing so they rendered her invisible. It was on one of these lonely afternoons, while tracing the patterns of moss on the brick wall, that she first truly noticed him. Silas Blackwood, the town recluse. He owned the sprawling, dilapidated ranch that bordered the woods at the edge of town, a place kids whispered was haunted. He was a silhouette of a man, etched against the vast, empty landscape of his own making. She'd seen him in town before, a fleeting figure in a worn-out truck, his face a roadmap of sorrows she couldn't decipher. He never spoke, never met anyone's eye. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had made peace with being alone. Today, his truck was parked across the street from the school. He wasn't looking at the building, but past it, towards the rolling hills that bled into the horizon. There was a stillness about him that was different from the town's stagnant quiet. His was a silence that seemed to listen. Ilara found herself watching him, this other outcast, this fellow island in the archipelago of Havenwood society. He didn't gawk or point. He didn't seem to notice her at all, and yet she felt seen in a way that was terrifying and new. His gaze, fixed on the distant landscape, seemed to understand something about wanting to escape. For a moment, she forgot the fire in her spine. She saw a kinship in his solitude, a reflection of her own aching separateness. He was a part of the town's geography she had never explored, a mystery she had only heard about in hushed tones. But as he finally turned the key in his ignition, the old engine rumbling to life, his eyes briefly swept across the schoolyard and met hers. It was for less than a second, a fleeting, accidental connection, but in that moment, she saw not judgment, but a flicker of something else, a deep, cavernous sadness, a quiet recognition. Then he was gone, his truck a dwindling speck on the long, straight road out of town, leaving Ilara with a strange and unsettling feeling, the distinct sense that he had seen not just the girl leaning against the wall, but the wall she was leaning on for support. The universe has a cruel sense of humor, a way of pushing you toward the very things you are trying to outrun. For Ilara, that push came in the form of a storm and a panicked horse. You met. Her family's aging quarter horse was more of a lawn ornament than a working animal, but he was Ilara's only confidant. She'd spend hours in his dusty stall, murmuring her secrets into his velvet nose, his silent presence a balm. When the thunderstorm rolled in, fast and violent, it rattled the old barn and Comet's nerves. A clap of thunder, sharp and close, sent him into a frenzy. He splintered the gate of his paddock and bolted, a dark shape disappearing into the sheets of rain, heading straight for the wild, overgrown fields that bordered the Blackwood Ranch. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Ilara's own pain. She ran after him, the muddy ground sucking at her boots, her pleas lost in the roar of the storm. She found him near Silas's fence line, his leg tangled horribly in the rusted barbed wire, his eyes wide with terror. And then Silas was there, emerging from the deluge like a ghost, a heavy rain slicker draped over his broad shoulders. He didn't ask questions. He simply took in the scene, the frantic horse, the mangled wire, the pale, rain-soaked girl. His movements were calm and efficient. With a pair of heavy cutters that seemed to appear from nowhere, he methodically snipped the wire, his voice a low, soothing rumble directed at the terrified animal. Easy now, easy boy. Ilara stood by, helpless, the rain plastering her hair to her face, a tremor running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Once Comet was free, Silas examined the leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. It's deep, needs cleaning. Bring him to the barn. He led the limping horse, and Ilara had no choice but to follow him onto the forbidden territory of the Blackwood Ranch. The barn was cavernous and smelled of hay and old leather. It was a sanctuary from the storm. As Silas worked, disinfecting and bandaging the wound with a practiced skill that spoke of a lifetime with animals, Ilara hovered nearby. The adrenaline began to fade, and the familiar searing pain at the base of her spine returned with a vengeance. She leaned against a wooden post, trying to make it look casual, but the effort of standing after her frantic run was immense. Silas, without looking up from his work, spoke. There's a stool by the workbench. Tall one. You can rest there. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a simple statement of fact, an observation. He had noticed. He had seen her discomfort, her rigid posture, and instead of questioning it, he had offered a solution. He hadn't pointed to the low, comfortable-looking rocking chair in the corner. He had specified the tall stool, a place she could perch without fully bending, without inviting the agony. A wave of something hot and overwhelming washed over Ilara, stinging her eyes. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged her reality without suspicion. This grim, silent man, this town bogeyman, had seen her pain and, without a single word of inquiry, had offered a gesture of pure, unadulterated grace. She moved to the stool, the wood cool against her hands, and for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something other than pain, a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope. The barn became her refuge. In the days that followed the storm, Ilara found herself drawn back to the quiet solitude of Silas Blackwood's ranch. She told her parents she was checking on Comet, whose leg was healing slowly under Silas's quiet care. It was a plausible excuse, a functional lie that shielded a more complicated truth. The truth was, she wasn't there for the horse. She was there for the silence. At home, silence was a weapon, thick with unspoken accusations and heavy with disappointment. But at the ranch, silence was a language. It was in the rhythmic sweep of Silas's broom across the barn floor, the soft nicker of a horse in its stall, the gentle hum of the wind through the eaves. It was a silence that held space for her pain, that didn't demand an explanation. She started helping with small chores, mucking out stalls, refilling water troughs, polishing old leather tack until it gleamed. The work was physical and grounding. It allowed her to be near him without the pressure of conversation. He would nod his thanks, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners, and that was enough. Dialogue was a currency they rarely traded in. Their relationship was built on the solid bedrock of shared tasks and mutual understanding. He never asked why she always chose to stand, or why she meticulously avoided the worn armchair by his potbelly stove. He simply accepted it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He'd leave a bucket overturned for her to lean on or clear a space on a high workbench where she could rest without sitting. These small, unspoken accommodations were more intimate than any conversation. They were admissions that he saw her, truly saw her, and he believed the story her body was telling. One afternoon, while she was brushing down a mare, he was mending a bridle, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. The sun streamed through the dusty barn window, illuminating a small, faded photograph tucked into the frame of a corkboard. It was of a young girl with bright eyes and a wide, gap-toothed smile, holding a tiny foal. Ilara had never seen him look at it directly, but she sensed it was the anchor of his entire world. She felt a pang of connection to this ghost in the photograph, another silent inhabitant of the ranch. Silas followed her gaze, his hands stilling for a moment. He said nothing, but a shadow passed over his face, a deep ancient grief that seemed to momentarily extinguish the light in the barn. In that shared, silent moment, Ilara understood that his solitude was not a choice, but a consequence. He was a man tending to his own invisible wounds, a man who understood that some pains are carried deep within, far from the prying eyes of the world. The ranch wasn't just a place for broken animals. It was a sanctuary for broken people, a place where scars didn't need to be explained to be respected. The trust between them was a fragile, growing thing, cultivated not with words, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of work and the profound, healing power of being believed. The fragile peace Ilara had found was not destined to last. Her frequent trips to the Blackwood Ranch had morphed from a plausible excuse into a noticeable pattern, and the change in her demeanor, a slight easing of the tension in her shoulders when she was home, was ironically what set off the alarms. Her parents, particularly her father, interpreted her newfound sense of purpose not as healing but as rebellion. Her father, John, was a man forged from pride and pragmatism. He saw the world in black and white, in terms of duty and defiance. He managed the local grain co-op, a position that afforded him a certain standing in Havenwood, a standing he protected with fierce, unyielding vigilance. A daughter who was acting out, who was spending her time with the town pariah, was a threat to that order. The confrontation erupted, as they always did, at the dinner table. It was a warm evening, but the air in the dining room was glacial. "You were at that man's place again," her father stated, his voice flat and hard. It was not a question. Ilara, who was standing by the sideboard, pretending to look for a napkin, felt her muscles tense. "Comet's leg still needs care. The horse is fine," he snapped, slamming his fork down. The sound echoed in the tense silence. "The whole town is talking. My daughter sneaking off to see that recluse. What is it you're doing over there, Ilara?" Her mother wrung her hands, her expression pleading. "John, please." He ignored her. His eyes were locked on Ilara, cold and sharp. "Sit down," he commanded. "We will have this discussion as a family, at the table." The command was a death sentence. Her breath caught in her throat. "I'm fine here. Sit. Down. Now." His voice was a razor's edge. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she was paralyzed, pinned by the force of his will. Slowly, as if moving through water, she pulled out a chair. The act of lowering herself onto the hard wood was a slow-motion nightmare. The pain, which had been a low hum, exploded into a blinding white-hot nova. A gasp escaped her lips, small and strangled. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from screaming. "See?" her father said, a bitter, triumphant look on his face. So dramatic. All of this for attention. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, hot with pain and humiliation. "It hurts," she whispered, the words ragged. "It hurts when I sit." Her father scoffed, a sound of pure derision. "Stop it. Just stop this ridiculous performance. There is nothing wrong with you. You're a stubborn, dramatic child, and I've had enough." The injustice of it, the sheer, brutal denial of her reality, broke something inside her. The fortress of silence she had so carefully constructed crumbled into dust. A sob tore from her chest, raw and animalistic. She pushed herself up from the chair, the movement so jarring it sent another bolt of agony through her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She only knew she had to escape. Without another word, she turned and fled, stumbling out of the house and into the twilight, leaving behind the wreckage of her family and running toward the only place in the world where her pain was not a performance. She ran until her lungs burned and the fire in her spine was a roaring inferno, the physical pain a perfect match for the emotional anguish tearing her apart. The path to Silas's ranch was a blur of darkening trees and familiar shadows. She didn't stop until she reached the relative safety of his barn, the familiar scent of hay and animals, a fragile comfort. She stumbled inside, her legs finally giving out, and collapsed onto a pile of clean straw in an empty stall, curling into a tight ball as if to hold her fractured self together. The sobs came then, not the quiet, stifled tears she was used to, but gut-wrenching, ragged howls of a pain too long held in. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a fortress surrendering. She was lost in the storm of it, unaware of anything but the rhythmic, agonizing pulse at the base of her spine and the crushing weight of her father's words. She didn't hear Silas enter the barn, didn't sense his presence until a large, warm hand rested gently on her shoulder. The touch was hesitant, respectful, a question rather than a demand. She flinched, then sagged under its steady weight. He didn't speak. He simply knelt in the straw beside her, not too close, but present. He created a space of quiet solidarity, his stillness a stark contrast to her violent trembling. He waited. He listened to the storm of her grief until it began to subside, until the howls softened into shuddering gasps. When she could finally draw a breath without it catching on a sob, he still said nothing. He just sat there on the hard-packed earth and straw, mirroring her posture in a way, sharing the ground with her. In the dim light she could see the deep lines on his face, the profound, abiding sorrow in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with a deep, resonant understanding. It was this look, this silent empathy, that finally unlatched the last lock on her secret. The words began to tumble out, broken and fragmented, nonsensical at first. He made me sit, she choked out. He doesn't believe me. No one ever. She trailed off, the memory of it too sharp. And then, a flicker of something else. The image that haunted her waking and sleeping moments surfaced. The fence post, the noise. It was so fast. The words were cryptic, disjointed pieces of a puzzle she had never dared to assemble for anyone. She was talking about the pain, but also something deeper, something tangled up with shame and fear, the origin story of her agony. She confessed the town's dismissal, the doctor's condescending smile, her mother's weary resignation, and her father's brutal denial. She laid the entire ugly truth of her isolation at his feet. When her confession finally dwindled into an exhausted silence, the only sound was her own ragged breathing. She waited for him to offer an excuse, a platitude, a reason to doubt her just like everyone else. Instead, Silas finally spoke, his voice low and rough, but as solid as the ground beneath them. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "I believe you." 3 simple words. They were not a cure, not a solution, but they were everything. They were an anchor in the storm, a foundation on the shifting sands of her reality. They were the first solid thing she had been able to hold on to in months. For the first time, she was not alone in her country of pain. It had a new inhabitant, and he was sitting right there beside her in the straw. Silas Blackwood was a man intimately acquainted with the landscape of grief. The quiet compassion he offered Alara was not born of abstract kindness, but carved from the stone of his own loss. As he sat with her in the barn, the ghost that haunted the ranch, the girl in the faded photograph came into sharp focus. Her name was Lily. She had been his daughter, his entire world, a vibrant, laughing child who had been stolen from him not just by illness, but by the slow, grinding machinery of disbelief. A flashback, sharp and painful as a fresh wound, transported him back a decade. He was in a different sterile office with a different dismissive doctor. Lily, then only 8, had been complaining of headaches, of a strange fatigue that stole the light from her eyes. The doctor had called it school anxiety, had suggested she was seeking attention. Silas and his wife had pushed, but they were met with placid reassurances and prescriptions for rest. They had believed the experts, had quieted their own gnawing unease. By the time a more persistent doctor finally found the tumor coiled like a serpent in her brain, it was too late. The regret was a living thing inside Silas, a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He had not fought hard enough. He had trusted the confident smiles and the dismissive diagnoses over the evidence of his own eyes, over the quiet pleas of his own child. After Lily's death, his world had crumbled. His marriage had dissolved under the weight of their shared, unspeakable guilt, and he had retreated into the solitude of the ranch, a self-imposed exile where the only creatures he had to care for could not lie or be disbelieved. Their pain was honest. A limp was a limp. A fever was a fever. He found solace in the simple, brutal honesty of their existence. Now, seeing Alara, so broken and so utterly invalidated, was like watching a ghost story play out for a second time. The parallels were a cruel, screaming echo of his past. A young girl in pain, a world that refused to see it. The dismissive words of authority figures, the guilt he carried for Lily, the crushing weight of his own passivity, now galvanized him. He would not make the same mistake again. He would not stand by while another child suffered in a prison of silence. This was not just about helping Alara. It was a mission of redemption. It was a promise he was making to the memory of his daughter. The next morning, a new resolve had settled over him, hard as iron. He found Alara asleep in the straw, her face pale and tear-stained, but for the first time, peaceful. He knew what he had to do. Havenwood and its small-minded poisons were the problem. Dr. Miller, her parents, the gossiping town, they were all part of the sickness. He needed to take her somewhere else, somewhere her story could be heard without prejudice. He knew a specialist in the city, a man who had treated Lily in her final days, a man with a reputation for listening. "We're leaving," he said to her when she awoke, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We're going to the city. We're going to find someone who will listen." It was a declaration of war against the quiet, insidious cruelty of disbelief, a war he had lost once before. This time he was determined to win. The journey to the city was a quiet rebellion. Silas's old truck rumbled down the highway, putting miles between them and the suffocating atmosphere of Havenwood. Alara watched her small town shrink in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a smudge on the horizon. The feeling was not one of escape, but of a tactical retreat. A deep, humming anxiety thrummed beneath the surface. She knew the storm they were leaving behind would be gathering force. Her parents would be frantic, then furious. The word kidnapped might be whispered, then shouted. The town's gossip would ignite into a wildfire of scandal, the troubled girl and the town recluse. But in the worn-out cab of the truck, a fragile peace held sway. The rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt was a kind of meditation, a sound that drowned out the noise of the world. For the first time, Silas began to talk, not just in short, functional sentences, but in a slow, mournful narrative. He told her about Lily. He spoke of her laughter, of her love for the ugly, one-eyed barn cat, of the way she would leave dandelions on his pillow. And he spoke of the headaches, of the doctors who didn't listen, of the gnawing, helpless terror of watching his child fade away while the world told him he was overreacting. He didn't dress the story in sentimentality. He laid the facts out, bare and brutal. His guilt was a raw, open wound. "I should have fought harder," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I should have screamed at them until they listened." You listen to your gut. A parent is supposed to listen. His confession was a bridge. It spanned the chasm of their individual pains and created a space of shared understanding. Hearing his story, Ilara felt the last of her own defenses crumble. She had been guarding the source of her injury like a dragon hoarding a cursed treasure, the shame and the memory of the betrayal too heavy to share. But Silas had shared his deepest failure, and in doing so, had given her permission to share hers. "It was an accident," she began, her voice barely audible over the engine's drone. "A riding accident." She told him about that autumn afternoon, the air crisp and golden. She had been riding Comet in the north pasture, the one that bordered the Miller boys' property. He'd been there with his friends firing a pellet gun at old cans. She'd told him to be careful, but he'd laughed, a cocky, arrogant sound. He'd aimed the gun into the trees near her just to spook her. The sharp crack of the pellet hitting a branch had sent Comet into a blind panic. He'd reared, violently, and she had been thrown, landing with sickening force, the base of her spine smashing directly onto a jagged, half-buried fence post. The pain had been immediate, blinding. The Miller boy and his friends had panicked, not with concern, but with fear of getting in trouble. They'd helped her up, insisting she was fine, just winded. When she got home, bruised and barely able to walk, the story had been twisted. The Miller family was influential, friends with her father. It was easier for everyone, including her own parents who feared conflict and scandal, to believe the boy's version, that Ilara had been reckless, that she'd fallen from a simple stumble. They told her she was exaggerating, making a scene. Her pain, born of a violent, traumatic impact, was recast as a fiction of her own making. The untold truth, now spoken aloud in the sanctuary of the truck, hung in the air between them, heavy and real. The city was a cacophony of noise and light, a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of Havenwood. The clinic was in a tall glass building that reflected the bruised twilight sky. Inside, the air was clean, sterile, and blessedly anonymous. There were no prying eyes, no whispers, no shared history to color the interaction. Dr. Anya Sharma was nothing like the doctors Ilara had known. She had kind, intelligent eyes, and a manner that was both professional and deeply compassionate. She listened, truly listened, as Ilara, with Silas standing quietly in the corner of the room, recounted her story. She didn't interrupt. She didn't condescend. She simply nodded, her expression serious, her focus entirely on Ilara. When Ilara spoke the forbidden words, "It hurts when I sit," Dr. Sharma didn't smile or offer a pamphlet. Instead, she said, "I understand. Let's see if we can find out why." The physical examination was gentle and thorough. Dr. Sharma was careful, her hands communicating respect for the pain Ilara described. Then came the X-ray. The wait for the results was excruciating. Ilara sat perched on the edge of the examination table, her hands clenched in her lap. Silas stood by the window, a stoic, silent statue of support. The moment stretched into an eternity, filled with the terrifying possibility that this, too, would be a dead end. Another voice telling her it was all in her head. When Dr. Sharma returned, she was holding a large, backlit film. She clipped it onto the light box on the wall, and the room was filled with the ghostly monochrome image of Ilara's own skeleton. The doctor pointed to the very bottom of the spine. "There," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Do you see it?" Even to their untrained eyes, the image was undeniable. The coccyx, the small triangular bone at the end of the spine, was not aligned. It was fractured, angled sharply inward at an unnatural, violent degree. "It's a classic coccyx fracture, and a severe one," Dr. Sharma explained. "Left untreated, it has become a chronic, debilitating injury. The bone is literally pressing on nerves and soft tissue every time you put weight on it. The pain you've been experiencing is very, very real." Ilara stared at the image, at the stark black and white proof of her suffering. It was a photograph of her truth. A wave of profound, dizzying vindication washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It wasn't triumph. It was a deep, shuddering relief. The feeling of a prisoner finally being exonerated. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, They were not tears of pain or frustration. They were tears of release. Silas moved from the window and placed a hand on her shoulder. He looked at the X-ray, then at Alara, and his face was a mask of grim, sorrowful validation. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The whisper had finally found its voice, and it was screaming from the illuminated film on the wall. The journey back was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. Silas drove with a quiet, focused intensity. In the passenger seat, Alara held the large envelope containing the X-rays and Dr. Sharma's report, like a sacred text. It was her truth, her proof, her shield. Arriving back at her family's house felt like entering a foreign country. The lights were on, casting a warm, deceptive glow. As they walked through the door, her parents were there, their faces a mixture of fury and relief. Her father opened his mouth to speak, to unleash the torrent of accusations she knew was waiting. But Silas didn't give him the chance. He walked past them to the kitchen table, the same table that had been the stage for her torment, and with a quiet, deliberate motion, he pulled the X-ray films from the envelope. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply slid the largest film across the polished wood surface toward them. "You need to look at this," he said, his voice low and steady, heavy with the weight of all he had left unsaid. Her parents stared down at the ghostly image of their daughter's broken body. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the anger, all the denial out of the space. Her father's face went slack, the fury draining away to be replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. Her mother brought a hand to her mouth, a small, strangled gasp escaping her lips. They were looking at incontrovertible proof not only of their daughter's pain, but of their own profound, catastrophic failure. The truth, stark and clinical and undeniable, was laid bare on the table between them. Alara stood in the doorway, watching them, feeling strangely distant, a spectator at the wreckage of her own childhood. There was no victory in their shock, no satisfaction in their sudden, silent shame. There was only a vast, hollow sadness and the weary, crushing weight of being right. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the next. Autumn's gold gave way to the stark white of winter, which in turn yielded to the tentative green of spring. The world outside healed and was reborn, and slowly, painstakingly, so was Alara. The surgery was a success, a precise and technical intervention that corrected the brutal misalignment of her body. The surgeon with skilled hands undid the damage that a moment of recklessness and an eternity of disbelief had wrought. But the healing was more than a physical mending of bone. It was a slow, arduous journey through the landscape of betrayal. The scars on her skin were clean, fading lines, but the ones on her heart were jagged and deep. Her relationship with her parents was a fragile, shattered thing they were all attempting to piece back together. The X-ray on the kitchen table had destroyed the old foundation of their family, built on denial and unspoken rules. Now, they were trying to build something new on the unsteady ground of guilt and remorse. There were apologies, tearful and raw, from her mother. There were long, difficult silences from her father, who struggled to find the words for a shame so profound it seemed to have stolen his voice. Alara listened. She accepted their clumsy attempts at reconciliation, but she could not forget. Forgiveness was a distant country she hadn't yet found on a map. Her true home had become the Blackwood Ranch. She spent most of her days there, the quiet rhythms of the place a constant soothing balm. She had moved into the small spare room in Silas's house, the one that had once been Lily's, a fact that was never spoken of but understood by both. Silas was no longer just a neighbor or a rescuer. He was her guardian, her mentor, her family in the truest sense of the word. He taught her how to mend a fence, how to read the sky for rain, how to listen to the quiet language of the land. He gave her space to heal, but he never treated her like she was fragile. He treated her like a survivor. The final scene of her long winter unfolded on a cool spring morning. The sun was just beginning to crest the hills, painting the sky in strokes of soft pink and luminous gold. Alara was sitting on the porch swing, a gentle, rhythmic movement that was, in itself, a miracle. A few months ago, this simple act would have been an impossibility, a torture. Now it was just sitting. Silas came out with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and handed one to her, taking a seat in the old wooden rocker beside her. They didn't speak. They simply watched the day being born, the light spilling over the fields, chasing the last of the shadows away. The silence between them was comfortable, profound, filled with everything they had been through together. The pain in her body was a ghost now, a faint memory, but the echo of it had changed her forever. It had taught her the devastating weight of disbelief and the redemptive power of a single person who chooses to listen. She looked over at Silas, at his weathered face softened by the morning light. He was watching the sunrise, a quiet peace on his features. He had saved her, not by slaying a dragon, but by simply believing that the dragon was real. The sun climbed higher, warm on her face, and for the first time in a very long time, Ilara felt the quiet, certain hope of a new beginning. The healing had begun.